Chapter 91. 2 days later. There were only 2 days left before the chief cardinal was expected to appear at the 2-week prayer gathering within the temple. While eating at a restaurant near the temple, Alone spoke. Evan. Yes, my lord. You usually wander off whenever you get the chance, but not this time, I see. At this question, Evan shrugged and replied. I went out, actually. Oh. Yes, but there wasn't much to see or enjoy. Just stepping outside, it looks like other territories. There doesn't seem to be anything particularly unique about it. Alone nodded thoughtfully. The Holy Kingdom does feel a bit like that. The capital viewed from outside the walls is truly beautiful. Even if one hasn't seen the outskirts, the rows of white buildings inside the castle make it clear to anyone that this is the Holy Kingdom of Rosario. However, aside from that, there's not much entertainment here unless you're a devout follower of Sironia. Evan. Yes? This might sound odd, but is there something behind me? Behind you, my lord? Yes. Evan looked puzzled and then spoke. I'm not sure what you mean. Is that so? Yes, but you've been asking the same question since yesterday. Is something bothering you? Evan looked at him with a confused expression. Ever since he had exited the sanctuary, the reactions from the goddess and Heinkel were strangely similar. Realizing he had asked Evan the same question yesterday, Alone shook his head lightly. It's nothing serious. Well, though, there is something behind you. What do you mean? The saint. The saint. As Alone turned his gaze at those words, there stood Saint Euman, staring intently at him with a serious look in his eyes. As their eyes met, Euman quickly averted his gaze. His movement was unusually awkward. What's up with him? Of course, he had an inkling as to why Euman might act that way. Alone, not being a priest of Rosario, had entered the saint's chamber through Yusha, a place he technically shouldn't have access to. Still, the reason for his current curiosity was Euman's peculiar behavior. My lord, did something really happen between you and the saint? We only met once, that's all. But doesn't he seem to be following you a bit too closely? For nearly 2 days, in fact. Alone made a peculiar expression at Evan's remark. Indeed, Euman's unusual behavior was precisely what had caught his attention. After Alone had entered and left the saint's room 2 evenings prior, Euman, who shouldn't have had any reason to follow him, had been trailing him for 2 days now, quite visibly, too. However, he only followed, never actually speaking to him. Did he somehow catch me taking the Eye-Eater's pendant from the room? No, that shouldn't be possible, it wasn't tracked by any magic, and it was well hidden. As Alone pondered other possible reasons, suddenly. Thud! Euman, who had been seated just moments before, seemed to make up his mind, stood up, and walked over to stand before Alone. May I have a word with you in private? Yes, in private. As Alone nodded, puzzled, Euman glanced around discreetly and then whispered quietly. It would be wise to be cautious of Cardinal Yusha, Count Palacio. Pardon? She is not a believer like us. Euman said this with utmost seriousness, leaving Alone even more bewildered. With an expression of profound resolve and a determined look in his eyes, Euman then said, Well then, I'll be off. He bowed slightly and turned to leave. Watching him walk away, Evan, just as bewildered, asked, What was that about, my lord? I have no idea, Alone replied, equally perplexed. Meanwhile, as Alone was grappling with Euman's sudden shift in behavior, over at the Blue Tower. No. I said no, you idiots. Out of nowhere, loud shouting erupted. Get out. All of you. Yes. Startled by her fierce outburst, the wizard scurried out at once. Watching them flee, she sighed heavily, massaging her temples as if staving off a headache. Why am I even in this ridiculous situation? Pina let out another long sigh, clutching her head. It was no wonder, recently, she had been under constant stress due to an absurd rumor. The rumor circulating was that Pina Crisin was in love with Count Palacio, a piece of gossip as baseless as it was bothersome, and it was causing her great frustration. Even earlier that day, one of her assistants, a mage who had been holed up in the tower for over 10 months, absorbed in research, had appeared with a cake that read, Congratulations on your engagement, Vice Tower Master. Sigh. From Pina's perspective, she could begrudgingly tolerate these sorts of antics, even laugh them off, no matter how often they occurred. However, the reason for her extreme reaction lay in the nature of these mags themselves. Wizards typically spend months or even years holed up in their labs, absorbed in their research, so they often miss rumors. This means every other day, someone new comes by to congratulate her on the so-called marriage. And it doesn't stop there. They don't just congratulate her, they assume, since there's a happy occasion, it's okay to be a little cheeky today, right? Leading to remarks like, maybe you should tone down your temper, or if you get mad, the count will probably run away, too. It was driving Penia mad. Why on earth do I have to be linked to that? She wanted to shout, but halfway through, she instinctively glanced at the tower's window. Though the height was absolutely unreachable by any person, after witnessing the performance Raiden put on at the Raxa's castle, she had started looking cautiously out of any window she passed. Click! After opening the window and checking thoroughly in all directions, confirming no one was there, she slumped down, exhausted, wearing a weary expression. But the recent annoyance wasn't the only thing bothering Penia. Although it wasn't usually this extreme, lately, she had been inexplicably unlucky. For instance, out of all the magical items ordered from the merchants, hers alone would be missing. Or among the magical materials coming from outside, only her materials would get lost. She had experienced 5 incidents like this in a row. Why on earth has my luck been so bad lately? Penia muttered weakly, almost tearfully. She was about to curse, this is all that, but clamped her mouth shut, glancing back at the window. Despite her gloomy mood, the sky was bright and clear. In the office used by the saint within Rosario's inner temple. Sigh. Human, who had just been talking with Alone, recalled the Count of Palacio's detached expression, utterly devoid of emotion. Count Palacio is indeed a saint. Of course, Count Palacio hadn't officially become a saint. He hadn't received his holy relic through a public ceremony but rather in a private, unofficial manner. However, even if unofficial, it was clear he was a saint. A saint is someone recognized by the goddess Saronia herself by receiving a holy relic. In fact, even when Human had prayed for guidance, the goddess Saronia had directly bestowed a relic upon the Count, affirming his sainthood beyond a doubt. The only thing Human couldn't understand was why the goddess chose to anoint him as a saint so secretly without a ceremony. However, even that mystery had somewhat resolved itself by now. Human cautiously lowered his gaze to the book in his hand. This ancient tome, passed down only to saints through the generations, contained the following words. Even with the great nation established by the goddess, it is impossible to save everyone, as evil hides deep within the shadows, fearing the goddess's dawn. To deal with those whom even the goddess's nation cannot save and to root out evil lurking before the dawn of the goddess has appointed the Silver Saint. The Silver Saint, wielding the Blade of Dawn, will save those untouched by light from the shadows and eliminate evil embedded in darkness. In the undisclosed dawn, they are those who extend the goddess's grace. Silver Saint. Human murmured the words Silver Saint from the ancient text, thinking of Count Palacio. If he truly was appointed as the Silver Saint, it would make sense why he received only the relic from the goddess without a formal ceremony. Thus, if Count Palacio is the Silver Saint, he must be kept away from Cardinal Yusha. A small sense of duty took root within Human's heart. He didn't fully understand why the goddess Saronia had chosen Count Palacio as the Silver Saint, but he knew that his role was not to question but to accept. It would be foolish to question the goddess's choice, and he understood that Count Palacio should not be aligned with Cardinal Yusha. To Human, she was someone who, rather than revering the goddess, sought to use her power for selfish means, no different from the corrupt. Thus, I must help the Silver Saint walk the right path. I must. With eyes full of determination, he closed the ancient tome. A strange and intricate series of events had begun to unfold. 2 days later, it was finally the day of Alone's investiture ceremony. Alone hurried to the temple for the early morning ceremony but soon found himself wearing a puzzled expression. There was an unusually large number of paladins accompanying him on his way to the temple. Of course, this wasn't unusual in itself, as those with black shoulder pads on their armor were the paladins directly under the cardinal, currently, the ones escorting Yusha, who was walking beside Alone. However, Alone's curiosity was piqued by the paladins walking to his left. Clad in white armor with blue epaulets, they were not under the cardinal's command but were instead the personal paladins of Saint Human, following him just as naturally as Yusha's paladins. Alone glanced questioningly at Human, then shifted his gaze back to Yusha. But Yusha, too, seemed bewildered, as if silently asking, what is going on with him? What is happening? Alone found himself even more confused, with no clear answers in sight. Chapter 92. The Rosario is governed by a total of 8 cardinals. In place of the Pope, who rarely leaves the confessional atop the temple unless for significant reasons, the cardinals lead the Rosario. They are divided into three main factions. One faction, led by Cardinal Myrania, is the pureblood faction. Another, led by Cardinal Gumanian, is the political faction. And the final faction is led by Cardinal Yusha. However, the pureblood faction under Cardinal Myrania and the political faction under Cardinal Gumanian were not particularly fond of Yusha. Yusha Bludia, backed by the support of countless devout followers, had swiftly absorbed surrounding powers and formed a formidable faction despite having only 2 cardinals. But that wasn't all. Although Yusha's faction was undeniably the smallest among the 3 in terms of scale, the other cardinals couldn't dare to underestimate her. Why? Because, inexplicably, she seemed to hold significant leverage over the other cardinals, weaknesses that, while not severe enough to strip them of their cardinal titles, were capable of significantly undermining their influence. For this reason, the factions within Rosario's sphere of influence bore little affection for Yusha. Recently, the 2 other factions had begun secretly collaborating on a plan to remove her. At least, that was their intention as of yesterday. Unfortunately for them, their plans crumbled today at the title investiture ceremony. Why, you ask? The saint. Why is the saint suddenly? The sight of the saint entering the inner hall of the temple, where the ceremony was being held, alongside Yusha left the remaining 4 cardinals in attendance dumbfounded. The other 4 were absent due to external duties. The mere act of appearing together in such a public setting, regardless of whether the event was an official Rosario ceremony or something as minor as a title investiture, was enough to signify an alliance between the 2. The impact of this revelation was unshaken. The cardinals present understood something critical. The saint had no prior connection to Count Palacio. In principle, priests with prior acquaintance with the nobles being honored at the investiture are the ones who accompany them. And yet, here was the saint, involved in the event, alongside Count Palacio, a figure with no apparent relation to her. This led the cardinals to a single, undeniable conclusion. The saint had allied herself with Yusha. If the saint has sided with her, our plans can't move forward anymore. How in the world did she manage to bring the saint into this? Or, this just became a massive headache. As quiet sighs of frustration spread among them. Alone, who was also entering the hall for the investiture ceremony, found himself perplexed. No, seriously, what is this? Should I even ask about it? He hesitated, glancing at Yuman walking beside him, then turned his gaze to Yusha. Her expression was just as puzzled as his, which only deepened Alone's curiosity. This concludes the investiture ceremony. The long, tedious investiture ceremony had finally come to an end. Congratulations, Count Palacio. Oh, I suppose I should call you Marquis now. Thank you. Andad offered his hand with a practiced smile, which Alone accepted with a slight nod, thinking to himself. That was painfully long. While Alone had heard from Sergius that these ceremonies tended to drag on, he hadn't anticipated it would last a full 4 hours. He clicked his tongue in exasperation. Well then, let's meet again when we have the chance. Andad slightly bowed his head, signaling the end of the event. People in the hall began to disperse one by one. Watching them leave, Alone heard voices from beside him. Congratulations, my lord. You're a Marquis now. Indeed. I suppose I'll have to be mindful not to call you Count anymore, added Evan. Nodding at their words, Alone replied, yes, thank you for the congratulations. Now that everything's done, what are your plans next? Alone pondered briefly before answering. Since the business here is finished, I'll head back to his cozy, peaceful home, perfect for roasting sweet potatoes. Is that so? You won't stay to enjoy the birthday festival? Birthday festival? Yes, today is Sironia's birthday festival, Yusha explained. Alone froze for a moment, blinking. Today's the festival? Yes. Funny, I didn't notice any preparations around the temple. Recalling the scenery he'd observed the past couple of days, Alone shared his thoughts. Yusha replied, that's because the festival truly begins on the night of the full moon. The Pope announces the start of the festival, and from then on, the preparations get into full swing. Although, since the Pope is usually occupied with prayers in the Holy Land, the Chief Cardinal, Lord Andad, will likely take charge of announcing it, she added with a playful tone. Alone nodded, pondering her words. The birthday festival, huh? The birthday festival of Sironia. In Psychedelia, it was an event players would encounter during their early visits to Rosario. However, Alone rarely attended the festival in the game. Instead of participating in the event, it was far more beneficial, both in terms of leveling up and gaining experience points, to explore the scattered dungeons or grind levels in Lartania. That said, while he had often skipped the event, Alone was well aware of the unique items that could only be obtained during the festival. Since I'm already here, I might as well grab a few of those while I can. Alone, with those thoughts in mind, spoke. Well, if that's the case, I suppose I can stay and enjoy the festival for a day or two. Oh, really? Is that true, Count? No, Marquis. Yes. Evan and Yusha nodded in approval, clearly pleased with Alone's decision. Well, if I can secure those items, spending a day or two isn't a bad investment. While Alone was making this calculation, a familiar voice called from behind him. Marquis Palacio. When Alone turned, he saw Human approaching. Saint. Congratulations. The sudden congratulation left Alone momentarily taken aback, but he quickly responded. Ah, yes. Thank you. Unlike the last time, when Human had warned him to be wary of Yusha, his tone now carried an almost unfamiliar kindness. It was impossible to read him. Whether or not Human noticed Alone's confusion, he gave a satisfied smile before turning his gaze toward Yusha. His expression instantly shifted, cold and openly hostile. For a moment, Human locked eyes with her. Then, as if delivering some profound piece of advice, he said, "Well then, I'll take my leave. Also, I hope you've given my word some serious thought." With a fiery, intense glare that seemed to brim with passion, Human departed. As Alone stared blankly at his retreating figure, Evan called out to him. Marquis. What is it? I know this might sound terribly disrespectful, but doesn't the Saint seem a bit off? What do you mean by that? You know, bipolar disorder. Evan's reasonable suspicion left Alone momentarily silent as he recalled Human's behavior, alternating between anger, seriousness, and smiles every time they interacted. Finally, Alone gave a slow nod. That might be possible. It was an objective assessment. Unbeknownst to him, however, Human was entirely oblivious to such evaluations. I must rescue the Silver Saint from the clutches of Cardinal Yusha's wicked grasp. Human, full of passion and determination, continued to burn with resolve. That night. Wow, this is truly breathtaking. It is. At Evan's voice, filled with awe, Alone looked out at the view from the room. Though his expression remained stoic, he couldn't help but feel impressed. This is even more beautiful than in the game. A blue moon hung in the sky, while the vast temple below was surrounded not by red torches, but by glowing blue ones that lit up the entire scene. At the center of the massive temple, an immense number of priests had gathered, offering prayers in unison as they awaited the beginning of the birthday festival. The sight was truly magnificent, leaving Alone momentarily mesmerized as he gazed at the temple. It's starting, Yusha said, drawing his attention to the platform. Soon, Anderd stepped up, signaling the start of the festival. Not long after, Alone noticed Human joining Anderd on the platform and thought to himself. Well, I did feel uneasy about falling out with him, but since things turned out well, I suppose it doesn't matter. While Alone was aware that, despite any friction between them, Human, being no heretic, was unlikely to harm him physically or politically, he still disliked being at odds with anyone. More importantly, Human, according to the original story of Psychedelia, eventually becomes one of the allies protecting this world alongside the protagonist, Eli Ban. In other words, having a bad relationship with Human would only lead to trouble in the future. With that burden lifted from his mind, Alone watched the festival proceedings with a lighter heart. At that moment, Human stood on the platform, preparing to deliver the traditional sermon alongside the chief cardinal before the gathered faithful. Suddenly, Human felt something was off. The figure before him was undoubtedly Anderd, yet something about him seemed subtly different. If asked to explain what it was, Human wouldn't have been able to put it into words. But the sense of unease was undeniable. At that moment, the chief cardinal, still wearing his benevolent smile, spoke. As expected, the saint can sense it, can't you? Excuse me? Human asked, startled. Anderd, however, ignored the question, looking at Human as he continued. I envy you, Saint. His voice carried an unfamiliar tone, deviating from the planned ceremony. A sense of confusion began to rise in Human's eyes. Simply by existing, you are blessed. The words that followed caused visible confusion among the cardinals and bishops seated on the platform. Priests who have prayed for decades, children who starve for days, devotees who endure suffering to fulfill the will of the divine, all of them, yet not you. I find it unfair. By now, even the faithful, who had been deep in prayer just moments ago, realized that something was amiss. They looked up at the platform, their expressions filled with doubt. And then, Human saw it. The chief cardinal, still maintaining his benevolent smile, spoke again. And so, here, in the presence of a new God, I ask you, the very symbol of this unfairness, to die. Crack! In an instant, Andard's arm, which had seemed perfectly normal just moments ago, began to swell grotesquely, transforming into something monstrous. A massive arm, resembling hundreds of tree trunks twisted together, swung down with overwhelming force, aiming to sweep away the cardinals and Human on the platform. It all happened in an instant. At the same time, Human's perception seemed to slow, and everything around him appeared to move sluggishly. He saw the cardinals and bishops on the platform, their faces frozen in shock as they tried to rise from their seats. He saw the paladins belatedly drawing their swords. He saw the expressions of countless priests, etched with horror, filling his vision in slow motion. Under normal circumstances, no one on the platform would have survived Andard's surprise attack. Holy power requires time to wield. No matter how devout or powerful a person's faith, invoking holy power necessitates prayer to the divine. That was an immutable rule. However, there was one person present who was free from this limitation. The saint, Human. Chosen directly by the divine, Human could wield holy power without the need for prayer. Crack! 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 In that split second, Human summoned holy power to block the attack. Ooh! Despite pouring an immense amount of holy power into his shield, the sheer impact of the blow made Human grimace involuntarily. Still, the barrier he conjured with his extraordinary holy power successfully stopped Andard's surprise attack, just as he had anticipated. But Andard's grotesque arm slid along the outer edge of Human's shield and continued its swing, hurtling downward toward the priests below the platform. No! Without realizing it, Human cried out and expanded his shield to cover a larger area. However, despite his efforts, Andard's monstrous arm was already descending on a group of young priests, too small to have yet reached adulthood. At that moment, Human saw them. The children, trembling in fear, their wide eyes filled with terror, looked toward him with a glimmer of hope. But those hopeful eyes only deepened Human's sense of despair. He instinctively shut his eyes tightly as if to block out the sight. And then, Thunder God's wrath. A low voice resonated across the temple. When Human opened his eyes, he saw it. Amidst the terrified children, a figure clad in a dark coat moved swiftly. The instant Human realized what was happening, an icy chill spread through his core. The next thing he saw was the hem of the coat whipping violently in the air, crackling with blue lightning. Finally, Human beheld the sight of Andard's grotesque arm, which had been swinging to crush everyone on the platform, suddenly vanishing as if it had exploded. And then, all eyes, including Human's, turned toward the man, the figure of the Silver Saint, standing against the backdrop of the blue moon. What is the meaning of this? The man's voice rang out, calm but laced with authority. Chapter 93. Alone knew that the chief cardinal Andard was a character that did not exist in the original work. Even if the character had existed, they had never made an appearance in Psychedelia. Because of this, while his outward expression remained neutral, Alone's mind was spinning rapidly. Is this how the story was supposed to unfold? Or has something changed? Of course, even with such thoughts, there was no way for him to know. The only events Alone knew were those from a point 1 year into the future. Anything that occurred before that was beyond his grasp. He shifted his gaze to Human. In the future, Human was destined to save the world alongside Iliban, ensuring Alone's comfortable life. Human now used his holy power to block Andard's attack. As expected of a saint, he can use holy power without a prayer or invocation. Alone, recalling how Human skills in the game always triggered immediately without consuming a turn, let out a sigh of relief. At least that's a relief. Naturally, the primary reason Alone had used his Thunder God form to rush here was to rescue Human, the one who would ensure his future comfort. If this event was meant to happen, then Human would surely survive. However, if it wasn't part of the original events, Human could have died. Well, in the end, he managed to block the attack when he used his magic, so instead of merely protecting Human, he incapacitated Andard entirely. But deep down, Alone instinctively knew. It wasn't over yet. Marquis Palacio, was it? Despite having his arm blown off by Alone's thunder godform and half his face blackened, the Chief Cardinal Anderd spoke with difficulty. His lips still bore a benevolent smile. Even though the injuries he had sustained were severe enough to be fatal, the smile never left his face. As if he didn't feel pain, or rather, as if it had been drawn there. Indeed. As Alone's reply fell, the priests, who had been frozen in shock, began to pray. At the same time, the paladins drew their swords from their belts, traced the sign of the cross, and raised their holy power. The surviving cardinals, barely clinging to life, declared Anderd a clear heretic. But even in such a situation, Anderd, still wearing that drawn smile, gazed down at Alone from beneath the platform. "That's nice. Really nice." Suddenly, such words slipped from his lips. "What?" By the time Alone asked back, the clergy had already finished their prayers and were launching attacks at Anderd. Some fired arrows of light. Some swung their maces. Some wielded swords. Some unleashed lightning. And some hurled pure divine power itself at Anderd. A tremendous roar erupted. Bolts of lightning forged from holy power rained down from the sky. White holy magic, shimmering with the glow of the blue moon, cascaded down one after another. Like a torrential downpour. Or perhaps, like a meteor shower. The overwhelming deluge of holy magic crashed onto the platform where Anderd stood. Even Alone, despite himself, felt a sense of reverence for the sheer magnitude of divine violence unfolding before him. And when the explosive projection of holy power finally subsided, leaving the platform in ruins, what emerged was Anderd, still standing, though his body was utterly shattered. His arms were gone. Several gaping holes pierced through his torso. The upper part of his head was missing. It was a state that all but guaranteed death. And yet, Anderd's benevolent smile remained untouched. The priests, cardinals, and even Eumen were filled with shock and disbelief at the sight. "It would have been a shame, you see. Your caliber is quite remarkable," Anderd muttered in a calm, composed voice, his expression unchanging. "I didn't want to let go." With those words, a strange sound began to emanate from Anderd's body. A grotesque, unsettling noise, as if something was forcibly pushing its way out. And then, it happened. The benevolent smile that had adorned Anderd's face just moments ago was replaced by something far more horrifying. From his shattered body, red branches began to sprout and grow. Rumble. Rumble. The ground of the great square, where the clergy had gathered, split apart in a straight line. Run! Move, now! Screams echoed as the priests scrambled to escape the splitting ground. Through the chaos of the now shattered square, a massive tree trunk began to rise, breaking through the ground. Dozens, no, hundreds of crimson branches erupted from the earth, spreading outward. The rupture extended beyond the square, reaching the white city within the inner sanctum. Crack! And finally, it began to reveal itself. The first thing to appear was a pair of grotesque, twisted hands, entangled in writhing red vines. Next came the sight of a massive statue's head, emerging as if being born at the cost of devouring the white city. Following it, the enormous body of the statue began to push itself outward. And at that moment, everyone present realized the truth. The benevolent Anderd who had stood before them just moments ago was nothing more than a puppet. Crash! In an instant, Anderd's body, which had been sprouting countless branches, was sucked into the colossal statue. Crack! At the same time, the face of the giant statue, resembling that of a human, split into four sections like petals opening into a flower. From within, countless crimson branches erupted outward. And finally, it appeared, consuming the entire eastern part of the white city as it emerged. "By your will, I have descended." Turning its gaze to the clergy, it spoke. "Worship me." With those words, it announced its birth to all. "I am Machina, the god of humanity." An outer god had descended. The priests, the paladins, the cardinals, and even Eumen stood in stunned silence beneath the blue moon, gazing at the outer god that had descended before them. The being, which had crawled out while devouring the white city, spread its branches as though it intended to consume everything. Even Alone was no exception to the overwhelming shock. Machina! Alone felt a wave of confusion. He had never heard of an outer god named Machina before. Of course, this timeline was not one he was familiar with, but even so, the existence before his eyes was undeniably alien. What on earth is Amid his bewilderment, Alone's gaze remained fixed on Machina. Then, he noticed something that struck him with a chilling familiarity. Black smoke, emanating from every part of Machina's massive body, weaving through the tree-like vines and filling the air. The abyss? Without realizing it, Alone thought of the keyword and recalled a piece of information he had once heard. An abyssal entity capable of granting divinity to individuals of significant power had infiltrated the Holy Kingdom. With that realization, Alone understood the truth. The being before him had been forged from the abyss. An artificial outer god. Alone muttered those words, trying to comprehend the nature of the creature before him. Look over there. Someone's. His thoughts were interrupted by the panicked cries of the priests, directing his attention to the area beneath the massive outer god. There, he saw something horrifying. There, amidst the chaos, were people. The citizens of the Holy Kingdom, limp and lifeless, ensnared by crimson vines. Do not resist. What I do is to care for you equally. A voice rang out, holy, yet disturbingly unnatural, echoing through the air. The crimson vines began crawling toward the priests. Stop them! The paladins charged toward the encroaching vines, slashing at the writhing branches. Soon, the priests unleashed their holy magic, piercing through the blue night and striking at the outer god. The scene that had earlier left even Alone awestruck played out once again. Thud, crash. In an instant, one of Machina's massive arms was severed and fell to the ground. Hope flickered in the priests' eyes as they looked at the sight, igniting their resolve. But their determination was short-lived. It's regenerating. What they witnessed was beyond belief. The very arm that had been obliterated by the divine bombardment was regenerating as though nothing had happened. At an incredible speed. Branches intertwined like blood vessels forming, and in no time, the right arm was fully restored. The priests were horrified by the grotesque spectacle. Meanwhile, the paladins who had been cutting down the advancing crimson vines began falling, one by one. Those ensnared by the vines had crimson branches sprouting from their bodies, turning them into lifeless wooden husks in an instant. Fear spread among the paladins. It infected them like a plague, rippling through everyone present. Soon, the vines that had devoured the paladins reached the priests, ready to snatch them up as well. At that moment, flare! A massive barrier blocked the advancing vines. It was Human who had stopped the vines. Surrounded by an overwhelming aura of divine power, he had created a massive holy wall that shielded the priests. The priests looked at him in awe, but his expression was far from bright. The immense wall of divine power, which only a saint could conjure, was rapidly draining his strength. And then, to proclaim equality and deliver it, I have descended. Yet, you are so ignorant. As the enormous hand of Machina rose high into the blue-lit sky, the priest saw it. A hand that, moments ago, had been too small to obscure the blue moon was now growing. Hundreds of crimson branches intertwined, expanding until the hand became vast enough to engulf the moon itself. Lady Sironia. At the overwhelming sight, the priests instinctively called out to the goddess Sironia. The cardinals, their faces etched with despair, let out heavy sighs. Even Human, who was desperately holding up the massive divine barrier, could only stare at the enormous hand in disbelief. What on earth is that? His eyes were filled with a mix of helplessness and despair as he gazed at the colossal hand. Accept me, all of you, for I am the god of humanity you have created. And I shall deal with you all equally. As Machina's voice echoed, the massive hand descended toward the holy barrier Human had erected. Clang! Suddenly, the sound of something shattering pierced the air. A faint sigh followed the sound, drawing Human's attention. Struggling, he turned to look behind him. There, standing calmly amidst the despair, was someone crushing the remnants of a shattered potion bottle underfoot while drinking another. It was the Marquis Palacio, or rather, the Silver Saint. Expressionless, unfazed by the dire situation, he spoke. Hold on just a little longer. Then, as if preparing for what was to come, he asked, Can you do it? Human, as though entranced, answered without hesitation. I'll try. The Silver Saint, or rather, Alone, nodded at Human's response. Good. Make sure to leave the ceiling of the barrier open. He then briefly checked the glowing white necklace hanging around his neck before uttering a command. A ray of thunder. Crackle. Lightning, infused with the light of the blue moon, began to surge and dance across Alone's body, crackling with raw power. Chapter 94. A ray of thunder? Lightning began to crackle across Alone's body as he took a step forward. Disassemble. The crackling lightning transformed into countless blue particles. At the same time, Alone picked up a fallen paladin's sword that had been knocked aside during the battle. Dissolve. The blue particles were absorbed into Alone's body. All things circulate. His body flickered, shifting like a faint afterimage. Form of the Thunder God. With the completion of a seal, he became lightning itself. Branches incoming. As soon as the barrier ceiling was opened following Alone's command, branches began to force their way inside. Everyone's eyes filled with despair at the sight. But at that very moment, Alone tore through the invading branches and shot toward the sky. Boom! With a deafening roar, shards of torn branches scattered, revealing the silhouette of Marquis Palacio against the backdrop of a blue moon. Hovering midair, Alone observed the branches now shooting toward him. As I expected, slow. Although the branches were approaching, their sluggish speed reassured him. Feeling the hilt of the sword in his left hand, he thought, "It's close, but everything's ready." There were two reasons why Alone had been unable to move swiftly until now. The first was the time it had taken to identify Machina's weakness. Until this point, Alone had never tried to discern the vulnerabilities of outer gods. Outer gods who hadn't yet ascended to God had usually followed the structure of their pre-incarnate divine forms. Moreover, most of the outer gods he had faced possessed bodies limited to the size of his magic's effective range. In other words, targeting their weaknesses had never been necessary. This time, however, was different. The Machina before him was so massive that it dwarfed the scope of Alone's magic and possessed overwhelming regenerative abilities. In short, indiscriminately using magic was not enough to eliminate this adversary. But now, at this moment, Alone had a clear understanding of Machina's weakness. It was thanks to an artifact he had acquired in the Holy Kingdom, a game item called Aita's Pendant. In the game, this necklace allowed the wearer to gradually identify an enemy's weak points after more than 10 turns of combat, increasing critical hit rates. And now, the weakness was unmistakable, the solar plexus. Within Machina's red branches and statue-like body, Alone spotted a glowing blue figure in the shape of a person, positioned at the solar plexus. He let out a deep sigh. Only one chance. My mana is almost depleted. Mana. That was the second reason Alone had been unable to move quickly. He hadn't expected things to escalate to this point. Most of his mana had already been used during the initial attack by Andard, when he had spent it saving Human. As a result, Alone needed time to replenish his mana. Even now, the results were less than ideal. His mana pool, unfortunately meager, had almost completely drained in the fraction of a second it took to manifest magic and launch himself skyward. What remained was so negligible that it was only sufficient for a single spell. Though he had guzzled 2 potions in succession, despite the risk of mana addiction, the recovery was painstakingly slow. Even at best, Alone's mana reserves were little more than scraps. In short, as ridiculous as it sounded, at this moment, Alone could no longer cast any powerful magic. Normally, that is. Phew. Exhaling deeply, Alone extended the sword in his left hand toward Machina. Formation of Thunder. He recited the incantation. Crackle. As soon as the words left his lips, the sound of crackling electricity echoed in his ears. The remnants of his mana drained away entirely, leaving him completely depleted in an instant. At the same time, an intense pain surged through him. His body spasmed in protest, unable to extract any more mana. Yet Alone did not stop chanting. After all, the spell he intended to cast was not Form of the Thunder God. Disassemble. Ever since his return from Raxas, Alone had devoted himself to the study of magic, specifically, the efficiency of material manifestation. For someone like him, whose meager mana reserves would run dry from a single materialized spell, this research was essential. Dissolve. However, after half a year of countless experiments, Alone had failed to improve the efficiency of material manifestation. Even so, he had discovered something valuable. And that was, all things circulate. Instead of manifesting Form of the Thunder God within his own body, he could manifest it within objects. Crackle. The sword in Alone's left hand began to absorb the blue particles, its form shimmering and flickering like an afterimage. This was a discovery born entirely by chance. While desperately researching ways to reduce the mana consumption of material manifestation, Alone had stumbled upon this unintended breakthrough. But now, in this moment, form of the thunder god. This accidental discovery manifested itself as the strongest magic Alone could wield at present. Crackle! The wavering sword in Alone's hand suddenly erupted with blue lightning, sending bright white currents surging outward. Gripping the sword as though preparing to throw a spear, Alone pulled his arm back and elongated the weapon's form with a deft arrangement of its energy. What he created was thin, long, and crackle, crackle, crackle. A lance imbued with the sharp, unmistakable power of lightning. The moment everyone, including Human, caught sight of Alone holding the lance of lightning under the blue moon, the weapon left his hand with tremendous force. And then, boom! With an earth-shattering roar, the lightning pierced through Machina's solar plexus. The moment the lance of lightning struck Machina's chest, everything came to a halt. The massive roots that had threatened to consume the entire Holy Kingdom disintegrated into ash, scattering into the wind. The enormous hands that had been moments away from crushing Human and the priests dissolved into white powder, floating away like snowflakes. Thud! Rumble, 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 crack! Machina's once imposing form, composed of countless branches, began to collapse as its structure crumbled into ash. And yet, instead of focusing on the destruction of Machina, everyone present, including Human, had their gazes fixed on a single figure. Under the blue moon, amidst the swirling white ashes that fell like flower petals, stood a man. Even though he had single-handedly defeated an outer god, his expression remained blank, as though the victory was only natural. That man, the Marquis Palacio. Everyone could only stare at him in stunned silence, or glimmering faintly in their eyes. But at the same time, this is bad. Behind his expressionless face, the Marquis was wearing a truly serious and troubled look. Everything had gone according to plan. Positioning himself in the air to prepare magic without interference from the vines, check. Identifying Machina's weak point with the Eye-Eater's pendant, check. Draining mana recklessly and downing 2 potions despite the risk of mana exhaustion, check. Everything had unfolded as planned. Except for one critical detail. He had not considered what to do after defeating Machina. To be precise, he had thought about it. After finishing his attack, he planned to conjure an ice wall with magic, carve it into a curve, and descend as safely as possible from the air. Of course, he was well aware that even with this method, the likelihood of getting hurt was higher than not. However, since this was the Holy Kingdom, he was confident recovery would be relatively easy. After all, the priests of the Holy Kingdom, especially those of bishop rank or higher, were capable of healing almost anything as long as the patient was still alive. But that was the key, the patient had to be alive. No matter how skilled the priests were, they couldn't bring someone back from the dead. I didn't expect the mana consumption to be this high. As Alone lamented the unexpected amount of mana required to adjust the arrangement for form of the Thunder God, he momentarily pondered how to handle his current predicament. Thunk! He suddenly realized that his rapid fall had slowed. And then, another realization dawned on him. Yusha! A soft, white, cloud-like substance created by divine power had caught his descent. You did well, my lord. Soon, the sight of Yusha's radiant smile, framed against the blue moon, came into view. Alone mustered his remaining strength to nod in acknowledgement. In conclusion, the Holy Kingdom's celebration of the goddess Ironia's birth was completely halted due to Machina's sudden appearance. This was inevitable. Although Machina was ultimately defeated, the damage to the Holy Kingdom was catastrophic. Even a nation as resilient as the Holy Kingdom couldn't hold a festival under such circumstances. As for Alone, the one who dealt with Machina. Are you all right, Count? Or should I say, Marquis now? I think I'll be able to move again soon. He was being treated in a hospital annexed to the temple for about 2 days. Outwardly, he didn't seem to have sustained any major injuries. The few wounds he bore were a result of his incomplete control over form of the Thunder God, rather than anything inflicted by Machina. However, the real issue was his mana core. A week of recovery for mana depletion. Despite risking mana addiction by downing 2 potions in quick succession, Alone had still succumbed to severe mana exhaustion. As a result, he was stuck in the hospital for at least a week. But to be honest, Alone was desperate to escape the hospital. No, more than that, he wanted to leave the Holy Kingdom altogether. After all, he had accomplished his task and had no reason to stay. The reason for his urgency was simple. Marquis. What is it? You're quite the popular man. Alone sighed. While staying in the hospital, he had been enduring the overwhelmingly burdensome gazes of the priests. He glanced toward the door, where priests passed by, their eyes filled with reverence and admiration. Speaking as though to himself, he said, "Honestly, I don't like it much." "Really?" "Yeah." Alone understood that being respected by others wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, immediately after being injured, feeling the admiration of the priests had been somewhat gratifying. After all, everyone has a basic need for recognition. But still, isn't this a bit too much? It was overwhelming for every single priest he encountered to stare at him with such wide-eyed admiration. And, truthfully, there was another reason he wanted to leave the Holy Kingdom as soon as possible. "Marquis, may I have a moment?" "Saint." "Yes, Marquis." The reason was none other than human. "Oh, Marquis, come to think of it, I just remembered some information I need to retrieve." "I'll step out for a bit," said Evan, rising from his seat as soon as Human entered. He quickly exited the hospital room. Left alone with Human, Alone scratched his head. "Well, have a seat first." "Yes." Human sat down remarkably quickly and immediately began to speak. "How is your condition, Marquis?" "As I said yesterday, it's not too bad." "That's a relief." Human nodded, seemingly reassured, then looked up at Alone with a gaze filled with both respect and reverence. And Alone found it unbearably awkward. Maintaining a good relationship with Human wasn't a bad thing. After all, Human was destined to become Eleban's right-hand man in the future. But having him come by every day, gazing at him with such admiration and reverence, was honestly too much for Alone to handle. Grateful for his concern but hoping to dissuade him gently, Alone said, "I appreciate your worry, but you don't need to visit so often. Please, focus on your duties." "However, that won't do." "Why not?" "Because you and I share the same burden, Marquis." "No, yours is even heavier than mine." "Knowing this, how could I turn away from you?" Human's eyes shone with even more respect as he nodded resolutely, reaffirming his determination. Alone could only look at him, utterly baffled, as Human continued. "I will never abandon you." With no way to make sense of Human's incomprehensible declarations, Alone was left staring at him, lost for words. Chapter 95. Alone fell silent at Human's words. More accurately, he was deep in thought. What is he talking about? Behind his stoic expression, he concealed his bewilderment as he replayed Human's words in his mind. Carrying the same burden as me? Perhaps an even heavier one. What is this supposed to mean? Alone looked at Human. The clear respect and awe in Human's eyes were undeniable, proving that his words were not a joke but genuine. Alone grew even more perplexed. Does he really think I'm that impressive? Is it something like that? He recalled the recent admiration and favor the priests had shown him, but quickly shook his head. No matter how he thought about it, Human's words weren't the usual expressions of respect or reverence. Thus, "Pardon me, but what exactly do you mean?" "HM. You said I carry the same burden as you. What do you mean by that?" Alone decided to ask directly. Since he didn't seem to grasp subtle hints, this time Alone posed the question plainly. Without hesitation, Human explained. "I meant exactly what I said. We share a similar burden, though yours is heavier than mine." "Me?" "Yes." Even though Human had clarified, Alone was even less certain of his intent. However, one thing became clear. He's definitely mistaken about something. There was clearly some misunderstanding. At a glance, Alone could see no similarity between himself and Human. Even by rank alone, Alone was born into the noble Palacio family, while Human was an orphan raised in an orphanage. Their upbringings were worlds apart. Alone had grown up leisurely, slicing into the meat served at his family's table, living as he pleased, while Human had been selected as a saint at a young age after a difficult life in the orphanage. Beyond that, their personalities, tendencies, and even values were completely different. From what Alone knew of Human, there was absolutely nothing they had in common. Should I point this out? He deliberated inwardly. Not only had he realized that Human was misunderstanding something, but also that Human's kindness stemmed from this misunderstanding. In other words, clearing up the misunderstanding here and now could potentially lead to that kindness disappearing. Caught in this dilemma, Alone thought, I should say something. Ultimately, he made up his mind. He decided to set the record straight. Of course, he didn't want to damage their relationship. After all, Human was the right-hand man of Eliban, the protagonist of Psychedelia, and the saint of the Holy Kingdom. However, based on his past experiences, Alone knew that the longer such misunderstandings were left unresolved, the bigger the problems they could cause once revealed. Thus, after careful consideration, he finally opened his mouth. Saint. Yes, Marquis. I believe there's some misunderstanding. Let me clarify, I am not in the same position as you. Alone spoke decisively, determined to resolve Human's misunderstanding. However, yes, I understand. The Marquis bears a burden far greater than mine. Perhaps even walking a path unacknowledged by anyone. At Human's response, as though he fully comprehended, Alone opened his mouth again. No, that's not what I meant. Then what do you mean? I mean it exactly as I said. This isn't me being modest, I'm saying that I'm truly not in the same position as you. Alone made every effort to explicitly convey that Human's assumption was a mistake. As he finished, he felt a slight headache coming on. He didn't know what kind of misunderstanding had occurred, but such situations usually ended up leaving both parties awkward when cleared up. Dreading the inevitable awkward atmosphere, Alone was bracing himself, but... Oh, I see. Human, contrary to expectations, responded lightly, with an even more pronounced look of respect in his eyes. My apologies. I seem to have been rather insensitive. Pardon. It seems I've made a misstep. I still have much to learn. Wait, are you sure you understand me correctly? As I said, I'm not in the same position as you at all. Yes, I understand completely. Human replied with a smile. The lukewarm reaction was far from the awkwardness Alone had anticipated. This led Alone to an instinctive realization. Does he not believe me? As Alone mulled over this thought, Human spoke again. I'm sorry if I've caused offense. I had no intention of distorting your resolve. No, that's not the point. You're misunderstanding. Yes, I understand perfectly, Marquis. Before Alone could finish, Human spoke in a way that implied sure, I get it. Don't worry about it. His attitude, as if he fully grasped the situation and was merely feigning ignorance, left Alone speechless. What? The person involved is telling you it's a misunderstanding, what is this? Alone felt dumbfounded internally. Well then, Marquis, I shall pray for the blessings of Seronia's goddess upon you. With that, Human exited the room. Alone, left staring blankly at the door Human had passed through, found himself unable to say anything. 3 days had passed since then. By now, Alone's mana depletion symptoms had mostly subsided, and Yusha came to visit. Are you feeling better, sir? Yes. Seeing Alone nod, Yusha, who had accompanied Human daily, smiled with relief. She then reached into her robes and handed Alone a black fragment. Is this an abyssal core? Yes. It seems, just as you suspected, Andad had been using abyssal cores. We've identified at least 40 of them. 40. Yes, and that's just what we found so far. There may be even more. At Yusha's words, Alone stared at the hollow, grey cube devoid of its power and pondered. Using abyssal cores to create outer gods. Of course, Alone had no prior knowledge of this. In Psychedelia, abyssal cores weren't introduced until years later. Even then, they were simply treated as a mechanic to scale monsters' levels to match the player's progress. In short, Psychedelia never delved into information about abyssal cores, so Alone had no knowledge of the matter whatsoever. Even if these outer gods are artificially created, the distinction is clear. Still, the fact that abyssal cores can produce outer gods is not something to be ignored. Since abyssal cores could circulate, it meant such incidents could happen anywhere. Having reached that conclusion, he spoke. Yusha. Yes, sir. If you uncover anything about where these abyssal cores are being distributed, can you let me know? Understood. He decided to leave Yusha a hint to investigate the distribution of abyssal cores. He knew that the Holy Kingdom operated its own informants directly rather than relying on information guilds. Those people are quick to handle heretical matters. If I leave it to Yusha, I'll probably get information faster than through the guild. As Alone continued discussing abyssal cores with Yusha, a certain thought suddenly crossed his mind. Could it be the Forgotten One? The idea struck him briefly, but he quickly shook his head, regaining composure. A fully realized outer god born from such a phenomenon wouldn't be this careless. Ending his thoughts there, Alone spent the next 2 days conversing further with Yusha. Around that time. Are you leaving now, sir? Well, I've wrapped up what I came here to do. That makes sense. Alone began preparing to leave the Holy Kingdom, but not alone. Oh, hello. Marquis. Mayan. What a coincidence. We'll be leaving together this time too, I see. He was joined by the mercenary group he hadn't seen the entire time he was in the Holy Kingdom for the title investiture ceremony. Why yes. What a coincidence. It's been a while, but why are you suddenly using formal speech? Ah, well, it's because, oh. Now that you're a marquis, the rank difference suddenly feels overwhelming. Mayan seemed unsure whether their excuse made sense, and Alone was left perplexed. Please take care of the Lord. Understood. Do you hear me? Why yes. Watching Mayan snap to attention at Yusha's words, Alone instinctively glanced at her. Well then, I'll be waiting for your letter. Of course. I'll write as soon as I return. Her calm farewell left Alone with little to say. It should be fine. With a light goodbye, Alone departed the Holy Kingdom. Shortly after Alone's departure from the Holy Kingdom, deep inside Yusha's office, a report was being delivered. 3 more have been discovered. Sergius stood before Yusha, giving his report. What's the count? If we include the ones just found, there are 43 in total. But there are likely far more buried in the underground waterways. Despite both being cardinals, Sergius spoke to Yusha with formal language, his demeanor stiff. Yusha, on the other hand, accepted his formality as though it were the most natural thing. Naya found this dynamic uncomfortable. If anything, Sergius felt a peculiar sense of ease in this arrangement, as though it was how things should be. Perhaps that was why. Cardinal Yusha. What is it? May I ask you a question? For the first time, Sergius found himself asking something he had never dared to before. What is it? Why did you let the chief cardinal go as far as he did without intervening? Sergius knew the truth. He was aware that Yusha had long known what the chief cardinal was plotting. After all, a year ago, she had instructed him to investigate Anderd's activities in the underground waterways. Not only that, she had even orchestrated the theft of several abyssal cores they had been gathering in statues through him. In fact, the reason the machina that appeared a week ago had failed to stabilize into the form of an outer god and remained as unstable vines was due to the lack of abyssal cores. This meant that Yusha could have stopped the chief cardinal's plans long before they reached fruition. And so, unable to suppress his curiosity, Sergius had asked the question. Ah. Realizing he had overstepped, his face filled with panic. Why didn't I stop it, you ask? Yusha chuckled lightly, as though amused, before responding. Let me explain. She slowly opened a drawer in her desk. Wooing. From it, 9 abyssal cores, brought by Sergius, floated into the air. After inspecting the floating cores briefly, Yusha destroyed them without hesitation. Crack! Crackle! With a single motion, she shattered the abyssal cores, each worth a fortune on the black market, enough to require the sale of an entire fiefdom to purchase even one. After obliterating them, she spoke. It wasn't to steal these. With a flick of her fingers, the shattered fragments fell to the office floor. This trash has no value to me. Sergius, swallowing hard as he stared at the fragments, was startled when Yusha addressed him. Hey, Sergius. Yes? Do you know what gods eat to grow? Gods eat. Yes, all gods, including the great goddess Ironia. At Yusha's question, Sergius hesitantly answered. A god is a complete and perfect being, is it not? A cautious response. Yusha, smiling, shook her head. No, that's not the case. Gods require 2 things, faith and reverence. Faith and reverence. Yes. And this time, it was simply reverence from the people that was needed. As a deep smile spread across Yusha's lips, a vivid memory replayed in her mind. The scene from a week ago. Under the blue moon, Alone firing a lightning spear at the outer god. A moment more brilliant and beautiful than anything else. The magnificent image of the great moon. A sight that would never fade from anyone's memory. Her smile curved wider, her expression serene yet eerie. Reverence meant for him alone. Her eyes glinted with a dark amusement. Within the crimson depths of her gaze, the scene replayed over and over, the radiance, the grandeur, the awe of that moment. And that is the reason. With her answer, Sergius could do nothing but swallow dryly and nod. For in her eyes, a sharp and unmistakable madness shone, a dangerous glint that warned him never to overstep. Chapter 96. The office of Duke Comelin, part of the Ashtalon kingdom. Was the result successful? Yes, according to the reports. However, it seems there were some shortcomings. He was receiving a report from a dark elf. Shortcomings? What do you mean? To put it plainly, the manifestation was slightly imperfect compared to the flawless incarnation you originally desired. I suspect the lack of abyssal entities might be the reason. The lack of abyssal entities? Yes. At the Dark Elf's report, Duke Comelin let out a thoughtful hum and sank into contemplation. And there is one more thing to report. What is it this time? It is said that the one who dealt with the synthetic deity of the Holy Kingdom was none other than Marquis Palacio. Ha, Palacio again. Yes. At the Dark Elf's words, Duke Comelin chuckled dryly. Then, as if deep in thought, he eventually said, "Understood for now." Yes. And make sure to inject a bit more of the abyssal essence into the experimental subjects currently under trial. With a casual wave of his hand, he signaled the Dark Elf to leave. The Dark Elf bowed slightly, then turned and disappeared. Paying no mind to the departing figure, Duke Comelin immersed himself in his thoughts. It's been a while. He suddenly spoke aloud. Despite no one being present, Duke Comelin greeted as if addressing someone. Yes, it has. With a faint sound of approval, someone stepped out of the darkness. From a place that had seemingly been empty moments before, a figure wearing a black sacred robe emerged as if they had been there all along. It's been a long time. The figure naturally seated themselves before the Duke. What brings you here? To Comelin's ensuing question, the figure leaned back in their chair. The reason for my visit? You already know, don't you? I was curious when you planned to act, so I came to find out. All the preparations are complete. Once we obtain what's in the jungle, we'll move. Comelin's response was dry. At that, the figure let out a contemplative hum, fixing their gaze on the Duke. A long silence followed. As the tension began to build naturally, nearing its peak. I see. The figure in the black sacred robe shrugged, dissipating the rising tension in the air. It's quite fascinating. To think you can still manage so well as a human. The figure stood up and turned away. Well then, I'll take your word for it. I'll trust that, before long, you'll bring about the great cause you envision. The figure in the black sacred robe cast a glance at the darkness in one corner of the office, then turned back to look at Duke Comelin. Anne? The figure began walking into the shadows. Just in case, I should warn you, be cautious of that man. That man. You know who I'm talking about. Their voice carried a hint of amusement. Count Palacio, or should I say, Marquis Palacio now. Leaving those words behind, the figure disappeared entirely into the darkness. Now alone in the office, Duke Comelin muttered quietly to himself. Marquis Palacio. He spoke the name softly. Having officially completed the conferment ceremony in the Holy Kingdom, Alone, who had now been elevated from Count Palacio to Marquis Palacio, was leisurely making his way to his newly established marquessate. Ordinarily, he would have headed straight to Tyria after the ceremony. However, he decided it would be wiser to first drop off the gifts he had received from the Holy Kingdom. Alone turned to look behind him. Following him were several carriages, heavily loaded much like the ones he had received when leaving Colony. I never expected to receive something like this from the Holy Kingdom. Alone gazed at the carriages, laden with goods, and marveled. As far as he knew, completing quests for the Holy Kingdom in the game would reward you with skill books or sacred relics instead of material riches. Well, material rewards are much better. As Alone thought about the wealth that would soon fill the Marquessate's treasury, a smile crept onto his face. At that moment, he heard Evan's voice calling out to him. Marquis. Evan seemed to have grown accustomed to the new title, addressing him without hesitation. Alone turned to respond. What is it? I was just wondering, why does the Holy Kingdom hold a conferment ceremony in the first place? Well. You don't know either, Marquis. Alone thought for a moment before shrugging his shoulders. It feels like more of a tradition that's been passed down over the years. I don't think there's much deeper meaning to it. Is that so? At least, That's how I understand it. Of course, Alone didn't know much about the tradition himself. His response was based on a casual comment Yusha had made. It's just a meaningless custom, but I'm glad I got to see you, my lord. Honestly, it does feel a bit pointless. I agree. Alone's gaze shifted toward the mercenary group up ahead. More specifically, his eyes landed on Mayan, who was leading at the front. The thought crossed his mind, not long ago, she had cheerfully climbed into his carriage to chat, making the journey much less dull. But this time, she hadn't approached the carriage at all. And then, flinch! Whenever Alone's eyes happened to meet hers, she would startle, nod awkwardly with a strained smile, then quickly turn her gaze forward again, repeating the pattern over and over. What in the world did Yusha say to her? Alone could guess why she was acting this way. A few days ago, he had seen Mayan freeze up like a mouse cornered by a cat in front of Yusha. Even when he tried to ask what Yusha had said, curious as he was, Mayan would grit her teeth and insist in an unnaturally calm voice, she didn't say anything at all. By now, Alone had given up on figuring out what had transpired. Well, if asking only makes her more uncomfortable, I'd better just let it go. Letting out a light sigh, Alone leaned back in the carriage, almost reclining. It was a leisurely afternoon under a clear blue sky. About 2 weeks later, Alone arrived at the Palacio Marquesate. After parting ways with Mayan and resting for a day, he promptly set off for Tyria. Having passed the now familiar scenery, he found himself within the royal capital and was granted an audience with Crytenia Scion. This time, however, the meeting took place not in the audience chamber but in Crytenia Scion's personal office. I greet your majesty, Alone said with a bow. Raise your head. A voice answered immediately. As Alone slowly raised his head, the interior of Scion's office came into view. Simple. The room was remarkably modest. Though the furniture was clearly of high quality, it was far more understated compared to the opulent office of the King of Colony that Alone had seen before. He couldn't help but glance around for a moment. I heard you saved the Holy Kingdom, Scion said. That's an exaggeration. Is that so? Then why is there no controversy about it? But first, have a seat. It must be a bit uncomfortable kneeling, after all. At her words, Alone cautiously rose and sat in the chair placed before the desk in her office, meeting Scion's gaze. With her golden eyes, a characteristic of the Astrian royal family, Scion spoke. Well, to continue, there's no need to feign humility. While humility is indeed a necessary virtue, when taken to extremes, it can become a hindrance. Then I'll refrain from unnecessary modesty. Do so. Scion smiled in satisfaction, resting her chin on her hand as she studied the Marquis intently. After a moment, she seemed to remember something. She retrieved something from one side of her desk and handed it to Alone. This is? Don't you like sweet potatoes? Pardon? Do you dislike them? No, not at all. I do like them. Take it. With a bewildered expression, Alone accepted the sweet potato. For a moment, he wondered if he had ever mentioned liking sweet potatoes to anyone. Shaking off the thought, he focused on Scion's next words. To be honest, the usual routine would be to conduct a formal ceremony in the audience chamber and then send you on your way. But do you know why I specifically called you here? As someone in service to your majesty, my insight into such matters may be insufficient. There's no need for such formalities. In other words, you don't know. That's correct. At Alone's response, Scion nodded and said, it's nothing particularly significant. I called you here just to have a chat. The favor I'm about to ask is simpler than you might expect. May I ask what it is that your majesty wishes of me? A month from now, there will be a conference of the Allied Kingdoms. A conference? Yes, essentially a continuation of the discussions held last time. I'd like you to accompany me as an aide. Is that possible? Alone fell silent for a moment before nodding. It is possible. To be honest, participating in the conference wasn't a bad opportunity for him. The center of the Allied nations, Turn, was a place restricted to administrators except during central conferences. It was also home to places like the Magic Society, where he could potentially obtain valuable items. Even so, he was curious why Scion had chosen him specifically as her aide. Although puzzled, he decided not to ask. After all, in this world, if the king orders, you follow without question. That was the law and the undeniable truth. Your prompt answer is appreciated, Cyan said with a satisfied nod. Now, eat it. Eat what? The sweet potato. Yes? Eat the sweet potato. Do you not intend to? No, I will eat it, but here. Yes, where else would you eat it? I'll eat it here, then. Though Alone had no idea why she was insisting on this, he nodded and began eating the sweet potato right in front of her. Of course, he barely tasted it. A few days later, as word began to spread that Marquis Palacio would be attending the Allied Kingdoms Conference as Crytenia Cyan's aide, two individuals reacted to the news more strongly than anyone else. One of them was Guild Leader. What is it? I have good news. What is it? It's about the Allied Kingdoms Conference that you've been requested to attend. Ah, did they cancel it? The speaker was Sealrang, who was sprawled out in the guild leader's office. No, it hasn't been cancelled. Then it's not good news. I told you I didn't want to go. But we've received significant aid from the kingdom, haven't we? Doesn't matter. I still don't want to go. Letting out a long sigh, Sealrang slouched even more, her entire body radiating the message, I really hate this. Still, I do have genuinely good news. What is it? Marquis Palacio will also be attending the conference. Seriously? At the secretary's words, Sealrang's previously drooping tail began wagging cheerfully. The other person to react was Commander. What is it, Vice Commander? I thought you should know, just in case. Did you hear that Marquis Palacio will be attending the conference you declined to join? What did you say? The speaker was Deus, who had been focused on training after declining the kingdom's request to attend the conference. Is that true? Yes, Marquis Palacio is confirmed to attend. I'm heading to the kingdom immediately. Then I'll prepare, wait, Commander. At least change into proper attire. Without waiting, Deus bolted toward the royal capital in his training clothes. His violet eyes gleamed with determination,